You know, that notion that young males, when they find themselves in situations of trepidation, fear or vulnerability, are supposed to dissolve those in the pit of their stomach like a bit of grisly meat to the extent that they become voiceless.
Michael Pedersen, welcome to the Speakeasy. I'm a bit nervous because I don't know what happens tectonically when the Edinburgh Macker comes to the Glasgow Speakeasy. There might be an earthquake, a volcano might erupt, but you're very welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And in particular, congratulations on your first novel, Muckle Flugga.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You know, that cross-cultural pollinisation is an interesting thing. Edinburgh and Glasgow. Now, I wear a lot of Edinburgh hats. I'm the Edinburgh Macker. I'm still technically the writer in residence at Edinburgh University. I was born and brought up in Edinburgh. I've been described as stridently Edinburgh, which I took as a compliment, but I think they meant as an insult.
But you're like Jean Brodie or somebody.
A little bit, yeah.
The creme de la creme.
But I live in Glasgow. I do all this whilst betraying the city and residing elsewhere, but I don't see it that way at all. You know, the Central Belt is such a beautiful area of cultural vibrance, and I think of Edinburgh and Glasgow as this pair of sort of synergised lungs, breathing together, drawing in the same air, pushing out different cultural outputs, but they're so close together. You know, if anyone that's lived in a big city like London or New York, it can take you over an hour to get across the city. I can be central Edinburgh to central Glasgow in 45 minutes and sometimes bought back and forth twice in the same day. You know, I've got friends who feel like they'd have to plan a holiday to come over to Glasgow.
A lot of English
Edinburgh.
people just don't get it. A lot of English people, until they've been, just don't get it.
Yeah. And
you say lungs, I think sisters.
Okay, sisters. Anything that has that sibling synergy, that sort of occult closeness to them, these two cities have it. And I think it keeps a lot of artists living in Scotland that might otherwise capitulate to the pool of London or New York or one of the bigger cities, because they can have these dual outputs within Edinburgh and Glasgow.
And these different experiences, but...
Yeah, and combined together, they're a bit of a cultural superpower.
Completely. Tell me a bit more about compare and contrast Edinburgh, Glasgow.
Well, I guess on a surface level, Edinburgh has so much hype about what runs in and out of town, doesn't it? The Edinburgh Festival explodes across the month of August. By all accounts, it's still the biggest arts festival in the world. There's so much heat on Edinburgh, Hogmanay, big bands playing on Princes Street, and then this really interesting now, a bit more grassrootsy and inventive trail around the city on the 1st of January. All these different venues, all these individually, collectively curated events that they think encapsulate, you know, the spirit of the space and the spirit of the area, and there becomes this big Hogmanay bubble. But of course, at the same time, that's poppycock. You know, there's culture in Edinburgh all year round, but it's on a so vastly reduced level to how it is during these peak times of the year, that you feel like you have to maybe dig a bit harder for it if you're not intrinsically involved in curating that culture. Whereas Glasgow, there's always been a reverence for the live music scene here. Anywhere where there's been post-industrial cities, there's been warehouse spaces taken over by art schools, by collectives that can put on events, I think, with a greater degree of ease, with less hoops to jump through, with less people chasing after every square inch of that space for its commercial value as a festival host. And I guess that's the thing. Edinburgh's almost measured up in terms of how much it's worth per square inch all year round, because of how much it can earn during the festival, that it makes getting hold of accessible spaces a bit trickier. And there's amazing people working harder to disintegrate that and to increase access to these spaces. But Glasgow feels like it's always had that on its plate. You feel like you can build events more organically in Glasgow to a level where they have both notoriety and are selling enough tickets to pay everyone well.
I think, is the Edinburgh Macca in danger of saying that Glasgow is the cool sister?
Oh no, I could never say that. I could never say it. I think they're both.
Yeah, they're both beautiful.
They're both equally cool. They're twinned in their coolness. My allegiance never wavers from Edinburgh. I've sort of. And also, there's microcosms within Edinburgh. I grew up in Portobello and I was in Leith at first when I was really wee, and then Portobello. And this sort of North Edinburgh area again has its own identity. And I think collectively, sort of Portobello and Leith scrumming together is one of the coolest places on earth.
So you're very good at place, of course.
Yeah.
And I'm going to Muckle Flugga.
Let's go there. I should point out that Muckle Flugga is not me just trying to, say an expletive by innuendo and still get booksellers to put the book on bookshelves. It is a real place.
And well, chapter 1, you've written this wonderful novel named for a place where the story is set. And I'm thinking Wuthering. I think what genius to begin with, that the novel is the place. Mm. And I'm thinking of Muckle Flugga, which I so enjoyed, as this beautiful combination of poetry, nature writing, and story and character. All of those genres sort of melting into the Cullen skink served in a great big bun on Muckle Flugga. What an achievement.
Well, I appreciate that, and it sets a wee bonfire in my heart to hear you say it. As someone herself who's, cast out a beam of courage and hope and, liberal storytelling in a way with a factual value to it that has offered lots of people support and also like a lighthouse guidance into the safe harbours.
You silver-tongued poet. Existence. I'm sure my mother warned me about silver-tongued poets, but look.
Oh, yeah, not enough.
Great plaudits for the poetry, plaudits and prizes for the poetry, and even more plaudits for the non-fiction, very touching, moving, painful even, memoir Boyfriends. And then this little leap, this little jump from non-fiction to fiction. Tell me about that.
So, the type of literature that has always appealed to me is almost sort of uncategorizable. Some of my favourite poetry is prose poetry, and some of my favourite fiction is autofiction, which is, generally, in the most part, non-fiction that's been cleverly sculpted or obfuscated to make it offer some protection under the fiction guys. So a lot of my favourite literature has always existed in those realms in between, those madcap realms in between. Categorization of literature is key for prizes and to know where to put it in the bookshelf, and for a reader who wants a bit of a security to categorize themselves as a reader of particular genre. But when you're writing something, sort of containing yourself in the box of writing within a genre from the outset, I think can be a very limiting thing to do for anyone that is naturally drawn to or has a proclivity for being an experimental writer. And you get incredible writers doing that on a high level as well. Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other, the way she formatted that book, coming out of poetry into the stanzaic fashion of it, breaking down the grammatical intimidations of a Booker Prize winning novel and pulling them all out of there. It's a piece of experimental fiction operating at the...
Do you think it's easier to cross genres like that and experiment because you're a poet? Because you start with the freedom of poetry and then everything else is a further development of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easier also because I consider myself a lover of all genres and a betrayer of each. So the fact that we've got that out of the way from the outset. But, poetry as well, it encourages you to explore the aesthetic of the page. The brilliant poets like Andrew Macmillan have done 3 collections of poetry, won every prize under the poetry banner, and doesn't have a single piece of punctuation in any of those collections, published under Cake Poetry, one of the most revered publishers. And you start with that freedom
and you take it with you to the other genres.
So you're pulling out the apparatus that you're told makes it great scholarly literature, and you're focusing on meaning in words, yet at the same time you're using aesthetic as a almost visual representation of how you want the reader to read it. So there's an emotive engine in the poetry by the spacing that goes behind it. So yeah, I think after having learned to break all the rules of poetry and being told and verified that it was a conducive way of writing in the poetic form, it definitely encourages you to bend the mold of every genre you go into. You know, in the non-fiction book, I was sneaking poetry in by any means necessary, Trojan horsing it in there, flattening them out, hiding it in between the chapters. And it's the same with the novel.
The vegetables in the tomato sauce, you know.
There we go. You blend them down, you hide them in there.
And Ali Smith, great Scottish novelist now, poet first, right?
Yeah, so many writers from that perspective. Again, we touched on Bernardine Evaristo, Jackie Kay effortlessly oscillates between all of the different genres, and those type of writers appeal to me because they're pushing themselves within the genre and trying to break out of the freedoms of the mold. If you write to a genre, to the specifications, to the structure that you think precisely fit it,
you start limiting yourself.
You've limited yourself from the outset, and perhaps you've not challenged yourself from the outset either, because you've decided what this book is going to be before you've actually physically written it.
But before you started breaking these rules, or maybe it wasn't before, but before Michael Pedersen, the poet, the author, was a young lawyer.
Oh yeah,
Goodness me, we have that in common.
Well,
you weren't wearing multicoloured Shetland sweaters to work.
Well, you'd be surprised. You do need a hobby job before the financially lucrative career of poetry kicks off. And I figured the lawyer one would be a good one to fall back on. But you know, I went to study law whilst hoodwinking myself into thinking that I was studying literature. Now, I wanted to study.
Interesting. This was at Durham, of course.
This was at Durham. I sort of moved on a glacial creep down the country from Durham to do my LPC at Nottingham to training in London. So I was fascinated by language. You know, I'd started writing poetry at school, actually for a Scots magazine at the high school called the Porty Blethers. And I was cracking out the dictionary and almost translating my angsty teenage poetry into a Burnsian form of Scots. That way, I could publish it within the school magazine, which had a Scots titular banner, but I could also publish it with a bit of armour of protection, because a lot of the kids that would want to rip into me for this, you know, it was a very risky thing to be emotionally vulnerable in a poetic form and put in a school magazine. Would have to crack out the dictionary at the same time if they wanted to get to the root of the meaning behind the poem,
far.
and they would probably get bored. And you know what? If they persevered and perdured beyond that
they
experience,
might change their minds.
They've earned their stripes, and I deserve the ribbon by that point.
What
Really,
brilliant analysis of change!
Yeah, so I guess I am a Scots language enthusiast. I love the language, but in terms of my utilisation of the Scots language from an early degree, it was as a protection of vulnerability. But I continued to write like that. I loved writing poetry. I cruised into English and higher English. Of course, in my school by that point in time, there's only like 3 people in the higher English class, so it's nearly one-to-one experience you get a little bit. And was the first kid that was going to go to university from my immediate family, but also from my near 30 cousin wide sprawling family across Scotland. So there was a big impetus on making sure that university worked out, that those good grades were utilised and put to conducive effect. And perhaps English and creative writing, even though it was my penchant and my passion at that point in time, was not the easiest of courses to float to the wider family diaspora.
But law will be a job.
Law, however, I was an amicable negotiating. There's a good job at it. It was on the upper scale of the good grades you needed to get into it. So both me and my family liked the fact that you were jumping a hurdle by getting in there to a certain extent.
And you interpret language.
It's all about this pedantic interpretation of language.
Like poetry.
Sat down and thought about it, and I think law is one of the most pedantic interpretations of language outside of the linguistic study of literature that you're going to come across. You know, the whole jurisprudence, the case names, they're like your books that you're calling upon. You know, your book titles, your literary synopsises. You've got your main protagonists within them. All of the advocacy, that's like your Shakespearean soliloquies from that perspective. Statute outlaw. Now that's your old Chaucerian verse or Walter Scott. You've got to chew through it to get some meaning out the other end of it. So I convinced myself I was studying literature within the realms of law, and it was very easy to do so because it is a celebration and almost a flamboyance of language. Plus, there's a lot of legal Latin maxims. I was never going to learn Latin under any other circumstances. It wasn't going to come into my schooling education. I wasn't really going to be exposed to it, but I was picking up these little bits of like codified verse, these little bits of like Latin language within the middle of it. And I joined prima facie the Durham University Law School magazine. So there was some journalistic aspects
But it must
going
have been
into
lots
it.
of posh kids. Must have been a bit of a culture shock.
Oh, it was wild. My college, Durham, like Oxford
You were in the castle, weren't
and
you?
Cambridge, is collegiate. It's slightly different in terms of the teaching ratio to learning in and out of college. But for what Durham lacks in terms of academic excellence compared to Oxford and Cambridge, it makes up for in pretentiousness of tradition. It thinks, right, well, we've not got the same degree
Apologies to any Durham people listening to this podcast.
they'll be on board.
We'll have a trigger warning.
Academic clout. It's like we better up the ante here. So my college was Castle College University. As you know, I got to live in an old castle, and I'd went from Portobello High School. Portobello's, it's experienced a lot of gentrification in recent years, but the high school I went to was this like 9-story skyscraper. It looked like an old Soviet prison more than a high school. It was labelled one of the most dangerous buildings in Scotland. They pulled it down stage by stage, and now there's something much swankier and better equipped to tackle people's educational needs. At that point in time, we weren't told there was a lot of great educational alumni, but there was a lot of great arts alumni. Gail Porter and Ewan Bremner, Spud from Trainspotting, they were the two big stars that came out of the school. And Kenny Anderson went to win on a gold in boxing, and then a couple of real life gangsters. So we were all quite impressed by that.
And now you.
Well, I'm not sure I'm in that category. There's maybe a sort of subcategory on the side of it.
I went back to my old primary school years ago, and they told me that there'd been a page 3 girl a year or two before me, and now there was me, and I should be so proud.
There we go. Yeah, you were in that swirl. And it's, it's a pleasure to be in the swirl with those human beings. They all each cut an incredible trajectory through life and have fought their own battles for it.
So you did your law studies.
But I went off to Durham from this high school, and you're having college feasts twice a week. Are
you all dressed up in your robes and
you've
stuff?
got a gown, you've got a suit. The senior man has to go up to a high table and say a Latin maxim to the master of the college, which ends in Floreat Castellum, let the castle flourish, and everyone can be seated. And then out comes the college cellar. And it felt like theatre. I'd always wanted to join the drama group, but it was too meek to do so and would have been terrible at that point in time, but I felt like I was engaging in theatre. Guillaume, the Prince of Luxembourg, was in my year, the heir apparent of the throne, who will soon be king, and was sitting at the table too along with me trying to put a penny in my glass, so I had to down it with wine. This was the biggest sort of immersive piece of theatre that I'd ever been involved in, so I think I had an exuberance for it which made a lot of the more prickly dynamics of, a lot of Etonians in Cheltenham Lady College and Harrovians like talking about school league tables.
You just bamboozled them with your joy and your flamboyance and your creativity.
Well,
you just cut through it.
It was a bit of a
Knife through
substrata.
butter.
I didn't take a lot of that. I mean, it just seemed ridiculous to the notion that they were going to look down on me for coming from this since demolished school that they'd never heard of, when their education cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, and we were both sitting at the same table, and perhaps I was even getting better grades on them.
Right.
The same,
perhaps, or definitely
same essay. So I engaged in the theatre of it. I loved it. It introduced me to a strange part of that social life that I wouldn't have came into exposure with. One of my best friends at Durham, who goes by the name David Sparrow under the book, he was best pals with Ewan Blair at the time, who was coming and visiting, and we end up becoming pals and going on holiday together and doing all of these different things. And when I needed a place to stay a couple of times when I was down in London, I got to stay with them. So as an 18-year-old who had, not been introduced to the sort of political swirl of the world in this way, I was just
So university was very, very important to your trajectory and your exploration of the world. And you talk about this a bit in Boyfriends, actually.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to Muckle Flugga because I must. But in Boyfriends, it's all there that, and suddenly I'm in Parliament and suddenly I'm in an old chaps club on Pall Mall and I'm going in and out of these places and it's...
Yeah. And, you know, as a more politically robust, hopefully slightly more erudite and sapient adult, a lot of the situations I found myself in, I would just avoid going into them at that point in time. But I felt like a little bit of
that's youth, isn't it?
A lost pup trying to work out what all this meant. And I took it in my stride, absorbed all those experiences and actually working out why I wouldn't want to be part of them in the longer term, and then working out why some of those friendships that were perhaps with people who've went deeper into politics or have went into the situation where, you know, it appeals to them to be a member of these elite men's clubs in London. We're no longer in each other's lives, but I guess I had to naively experience it to ruminate on why I didn't think that would work for me as a sort of artistically sentient human being as the world went on. But you know, you have to understand the bias and be able to, in order to be able to tackle it and shake it. And I also felt,
it's given you, and you've got a confidence, Michael. You know, the lad from Portobello with the sky-rise unsafe school building can now speak to anyone, right?
There's the roguish aspect that I wasn't supposed to be in there. So you feel like you're getting a taste of something which has been denied to you.
Or maybe I'm as good as anybody. No one's equal, but anyone's equal, no one's superior. But I'm as good as you. I
think so. Yeah, I think we're all on an equal term as human beings, and actually the kindnesses we cast are what are going to be the echoes of the memories of us long after we're gone, as opposed to what ladders we climbed from those perspectives. And you learn very quickly there's kind people all across
you had
these
lots
different
of kindness?
levels. I think so, yeah. You know, I was always quite a sort of soppy and sentimental human being. I was always spilling out the edges. I was always trying to, from a young age, you know, I was obsessed with friendship. I was obsessed with emotionally vulnerable friendships. And
it comes through in your work.
I think so. I think that bonfire is just blazing brighter and brighter. You know, my mum that I had around me, she'd been a maternity nurse and then a nursery nurse, and she had friends around her from every walk of her life. Her best friend from when she was young still comes round to the house twice a week. They chat each other's faces off so much they have joy the following morning. And, you know, they go into the toilet together, they pee in a carousel and come back out further down the line on the same story. And I remember just being ensorcelled by that, thinking I want a piece of that friendship pie. And then I've got one older sister. She's having her female friends to stay over. They're hiding under the sheets together. They're spilling secrets. And when they left for school the next day, they walk down the road linking arms. There's this beautiful physical vocabulary.
Okay, so now I've got to ask you about boyfriend. Now I've got to go to Boyfriends.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to Muckle Flugga because I read that more recently. But
yeah.
So you're talking about this female intimacy and friendship. And Boyfriends, beautiful memoir, beautiful tribute to your dear friend Scott Hutchison.
Yeah.
You know, the plaudits for that book are all about the antidote to toxic masculinity, or just the limit, the emotional limits that are imposed on so many men and boys.
Mm-hmm.
When you were writing that book, presumably in a place of considerable pain, did you think of it that way? Did you think this is my answer to these currents that are around me in terms of the manosphere and in terms of men and boys who can't speak about their feelings, who can't show intimacy towards each other? Or did you just write a story that was in you that needed to be written?
So no, I didn't think I was writing into an answer. I was writing a series of love letters to the various friendships that have inhabited my life. And, you know, I wrote the early draft of it quite early. Scott had been pretty much my dearest friend in the world at that point in time, the friend I was closest to, and he was removed from this planet dramatically, suddenly. For many of us, it felt very unfairly. And I had to work out what version of myself I was going to be in his absence. And that was really the only answer I was looking for. And I wanted to be a version of myself that was still able to pay tribute to this incredible friendship, which had fulfilled me in a way that I felt I would experience the joy of it the rest of my life, whilst knowing that physically he was no longer there. So I was trying to experience this grief as the last reverberation of loving someone. You know, all this love we want to put into someone, but corporally, temporally, physically, they're no longer there to put into us. So how do we rewire those currents? And I knew I needed to write about this, to explore it, to investigate it. And I wanted to write about Scott to say thank you, in a sense. But I knew in this sort of raw and vulnerable state, I was at risk of writing a grief memoir, and I didn't want to write a grief memoir. That wasn't the type of person I messed. They were silly, smutty, sexy, all these incredible things. So I wrote about my favourite moments with this person, and I thought that I can handle at this point in time. And that is the most important element of this grief, because that is the thing I'm longing to be back in my life the most. So I want to write myself close to that. And what could have been a grief memoir became something for friends here, there and elsewhere, and all the friends we've loved to excess. It still doesn't feel like enough, but also had to be for friends who've left this world before their time, and how we celebrate them and trophesize them in their absence. But you know, all of us, if we're lucky enough, there's also all those friendship moments that we don't manage to make come to fruition because geography moves us apart, or political currents move us apart, or families, or any of these different things causes a gulf between us. But it doesn't mean we don't carry the anticipation of being in their company with us. So I wanted to write something for the moments of friendships which nearly exist at the same time. And all the friends I wrote about, they're no longer in my life, and not necessarily as tragically as Scott via more life and death circumstances. We've moved apart, everything's got in the way, but I didn't want those friendships to be seen as failures, because they still form such a key part of my emotional toolkit, and they form a key part of the way that I'm able to relate to anyone I love that's in my life now.
You know, I think well, you put it so well, that is the joy of boyfriends. Yes, a lot has been written about the masculine aspect, and I want to come back to that with Muckle Flugga, but even as a woman, this idea of love letter to friendship, because friendship is not, in the culture, is not treated like familial relationships. So, for example, when you lose a parent or a partner, or God forbid, a child, society knows to some extent how to respond. Now, a lot has been said and written about how, you know, Northern Hemisphere people cope with it compared to cultures where it's much more out there, and the wisdom of one approach or the other. But when a dear, dear friend dies, you don't necessarily get all the condolence letters and the this, that and the other. I remember years ago I lost a dear friend, and a colleague wrote me a condolence note and said, close friendships are not dealt with by society in the same way, and I know you must be grieving. And I thought it was a beautiful gesture on her part. And I think that maybe the joy of boyfriends, yes, of course, it's particularly interesting and fascinating to the culture because of the particular challenges of manhood and feelings. But even as a woman, to be writing love letters to lost friends, to be celebrating their memory, to be taking them with us on the onward journey, I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, and you know, that was what the title was about, calling it boyfriends. Those two words together to the male psyche can be antagonistic.
Yeah.
It's this queer literature. What is this saying about me? What do those two words mean together? They're not in common usage. If you put them into Microsoft Word, it says you've made a grammatical error by having them that close together, whereas girlfriend separately in Microsoft Word goes by. It has a cultural usage.
Yeah.
We see it as being a sort of totemic sacred nod to a type of friendship which carries a sort of vital closeness for us, which is almost like a covenant friendship that from that perspective. And boyfriends, you know, I've written about male friendship deeply in it, but it was almost written in homage to all of the incredible female friendships that I had around me at the same time, and wanting my male friendships to reach into those voids. So it wasn't supposed to be about the masculinity problem, but in fact about vulnerability within friendship catching up from
But
that
it's just that people
perspective.
responded, you know, the culture, the commentators, all the brilliant plaudits and endorsements. What they noticed most was that here's a man who can write about love for male friends in the way that people don't often do.
Yeah. And you know, that was one of the beautiful things. I think it got so many plaudits and endorsements because it also invited people to talk about the friendships that they were missing within, which we don't get enough of. Like you're saying, when you got that grief card, it can be so heavily overlooked. It
I was
leaves
so
us.
touched by that. You know, when you lose parents, whatever, society knows what to do. And you can argue they don't do it enough, or they only do it for 2 weeks, and they whatever. And the Victorians were better at it, and they could wear, you know, this colour and then that colour, and within a year you have them fine. But for friendships,
Yeah.
not even day one, not even a day off work or a condolence. So I think this is why, it's part of why
Yeah.
this book means so much to so many people.
Because you're lost, you're listless, you're in this liminal space. There is no structure there for you to cling on to say, this is how I'm supposed to feel at this circumstance. You're just supposed to swallow it from that perspective.
And it's one of the reasons why, I mean, you're young and your career has so much further to go, but this is one of the reasons why you remind me of Julian Barnes. The ability to write about the really tough stuff, but also, and now I'm finally going to Muckle Flugga, the ability to alternate between memoir, non-fiction, and fiction, which I think is, and you talked about, I don't care about genre, I'm a poet, I can cross these boundaries.
It's not that I don't care about genre. I worship at the altar of every one of those genres.
Yeah.
So I don't feel
But you're not
that I
caged.
can't spill out the
You're
edges.
you're not caged by it. You're breaking the rules. You go to Durham Law School and then you're breaking the rules. And so Muckle Flugga, I felt, having read it after Boyfriends, is a perfect continuation. But I have to say that the additional piece is the nature part. Because like other great writers, and there's so many, you know, the Brontes, Thomas Hardy, whatever, the nature, the physical surroundings are completely connected to the human characters. And sometimes it's almost as if their feelings and their moods are reflected in whatever, the weather, the flora and fauna, and vice versa. And so much about isolation. And today, in most parts of the world, or so many parts of the world, particularly in the cities, people are isolated in a different way. They're atomized and typing away and being on the internet, but very atomized. But there in Muckle Flugga, you are very physically isolated, sometimes bleak, but surrounded by this beautiful, sometimes threatening, sometimes benign environment.
Yeah, I very much wanted that island to feel like a character in itself. The weather, the tempest of it. It's rumoured to be a shapeshifter underfoot. There's a real personality to the island. And, you know, the thematic link between the two, by the end of touring Boyfriends, it came out in America as well, and I toured all over the UK and some European cities. It was a long and engaged tour. I was a human hard drive of friendship lore. If someone had written a fiction book, a script about friendship, I've got in Canada put on a panel with a clinical psychologist that specialise in friendship lore and how we carry it with us. You know, I'd absorbed a lot of their stories, so I actually felt more galvanised to be talking about the issues in Boyfriends than I ever had been before when I started writing it. I guess there was a sort of lost naivety about where the compass of that book was going, and by the end of it I had the lore that orbited around it. All of the issues I wanted to tackle. I'd made an enemy of the expression man up by the end of it. You know, that notion that young males when they find themselves in situations of trepidation, fear, or vulnerability, are supposed to dissolve those in the pit of their stomach like a bit of grisly meat, to the extent that they become voiceless, so you don't show any of those fears, shames, or vulnerabilities. And of course, there's two ways that will go. It'll either numbify your senses in the long term, or you will eventually implode from the weight of it all. So a lot of the dilemmas that I felt I was writing into, I had only touched on the edges of them, because I wanted Boyfriends to be quite a raw, urgent event, whereas when we were crossing over to take those into the fictional world in Muckle Flugga, I was able to use my own experiences alongside those I'd researched, alongside the fictitious world that existed between the two, and create more interesting character dilemmas. And all of those character dilemmas would be absolutely heightened if they were on this isolated island. And often with island life, you know, as soon as you say remote or isolated, it's remote or isolated to who? But I think with Muckle Flugga, we can even say, on Muckle Flugga, you are remote and isolated. It's the most used to be the most northerly inhabited of the Shetland Islands, back when the lighthouse keepers lived there full time. Since the lighthouses have been automated, it's still behind it. But we're going back to a point in time where it is very much peopled. But if you stand on that island, you're closer to the North Pole than you are to London, which gives you a grasp of, you know, how far off into the abyss.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
And I think that people in the UK, particularly down south, but maybe even in Glasgow and Edinburgh, might forget just how far north that is.
Yeah. And I mean, it was, you know, that island was part of Norway for longer than it's been part of Scotland. And the whole name Muckle Flugga goes back to Michael Flugga, which is Old Norse. So there is this very sort of Viking Norse element to it from that perspective. And I felt if you were to take all of these considerations, clash them between some characters, and debate your particular lot under the gargantuousness of the sky and the universe and the ocean beyond, there could not be a more intensely dramatic place to do so in my mind, or that I have laid eyes upon, than this particular
Wuthering
island
Heights,
of Muckle Flugga.
Flugga. There we are, these intense characters in this intense situation, this dramatic physical and emotional environment. And the main characters, again, are three men.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I knew this needed to be a sort of hot friendship romance in the belly of it. And I knew it needed to be set in an edifice which was somewhat, you know, mythical, maybe even oracular. And I'd written most of Boyfriends in the Curfew Tower in Northern Ireland, this old watchtower that sort of looks back across to Scotland. And I knew when it came to setting the novel, it had to be in Scotland, and it had to be in one of the Stevenson family lighthouses.
Right.
I just didn't expect it to be that lighthouse. I encountered Muckle Flugga Lighthouse by accident. I was doing an event up in Unst with Bill Drummond, and he was showing his film in Baltasound Town Hall, which is the most northerly inhabited most northern arts venue in the UK. And we got invited to have brunch with someone the following morning, and said, you might want to come and see me. I live in this interesting building. We got to that building, and it was Muckle Flugga Shore Station. The lighthouse keepers, let's say, they were pretty much 1 month on, 1 month off. And when they were off, they lived in a shore station on North Unst. And it, interestingly, is peaked just round the cliff face from the lighthouse, so you can't see the lighthouse from the cottage, so that it wasn't a constant reminder of where you were when you weren't there. So we stayed in this station. We went for a big epic walk afterwards, and I saw that lighthouse emerge out of the ocean like the last giant at the end of the earth. And I thought that's where these male characters would be, because they'll never be bigger or more formidable than this lighthouse of the elements. So whatever ferocity or ire they have bubbling away inside them, it will be dwarfed by the elements of nature and the majesty of this edifice. So I wanted them to constantly be reminded of their own smallness, hopefully in a humbling way, which would serve to ameliorate them as human beings. But there's so many different types of masculinity we encounter. Perhaps the most extreme example of that of the lighthouse keeper, the father and his son Oos. Now the father is particularly full of whiskey and ire. He's half in love and half in hate with the world, which is how he feels about himself at the same time. He is this sort of mirrored reflection of that. And he's a very dangerous person to be close to, and he's a very dangerous person to love, in that he takes out the majority of his ferocity on those in his closest orbit. And for the father, that is very much Us,
And I think for many
otherworldly son.
readers, well, I can't speak for readers, but so the father, obviously, this is a very, very dramatic, exaggerated, terrifying character, but not without a great deal of complexity, because there is the public service, there is the historic guilt coming from a family of wreckers who are actually enjoying the bounty of wrecked ships rather than trying to prevent them hitting the rock. So there's all of that complexity and some gentleness and some nurturing, but it's just dangerous. It's unpredictable, like the elements.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that a lot of people, most people don't have fathers who are lighthouse keepers with big beards and all the rest of it, but they will still, for many people, there'll be an element of recognition there.
Yeah, definitely. The father is a conglomeration, a sort of maelstrom of all of the Raj Scottish dads I encountered growing up. So there's little elements of his most formidable and nefarious facets in a lot of the family members that I've had around me. And he's exaggerated in the extent that he's absorbed all of these different facets of their human behaviour, but there's nothing the father's done in terms of the nefariousness of his actions that I don't think people around me have encountered a version of that within their lives. And obviously it's extreme because you're making an almost belligerent tapas version of all of those strands. And he's, for me and for a lot of the readers as well, they've told me he is also to an extent unfortunately lovable. There's a line in the book that the father is a cruel, brave man. He struck braver men, embraced crueler. My editor at Faber actually said that she thinks we might need to set up a helpline for those that accidentally fall in love with the father and feel guilty about it at the same time. But
I felt ambivalent about the father.
Yeah.
I wasn't, to be honest, until I got quite close to the end of the book, I wasn't really sure whether I thought he was totally the bad guy or the good guy or somewhere in between, or just like I was ambivalent about the interloper.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think the father's a deeply venerable human being, as well as being a difficult person to be around. He's suffered a terrible grief. The reverberations of that are still pulling and clawing inside them. He's lost the mother, who was his sort of social currency and what he considered the best thing about himself. And also in his job, he mans that lighthouse like it would take 10 other keepers to do so.
Yeah.
And there's a philanthropic element of that. Every life that's lost because he's not manned the lighthouse to his utmost ability, he carries as a great weight inside of him.
And that is admirable.
Yeah.
So he is a complex character, and I won't go to a therapist about it, but I think it makes it great writing that there is ambivalence, and there should be.
Yeah, I think so. We're all bifurcated beings. I don't think there's any clear-cut heroes and villains in this book. There's some that are more immediately likable, but everyone is a fractured human being displaying their foibles as fabulously as their most positive and endearing qualities.
So let's talk about the two younger men.
Yeah. So Us is the lighthouse keeper's son. He's, expected to take over the reins of the lighthouse. It's old bonds up against new from that perspective, and wants to impress the father and wants to be close to him, but has also lost his mother and feels the absence of that sort of kilted into the sky and floating over them the whole of the time. But his real sort of creative passion lies in knitwear. He's an exceptional knitter, sewer, artist when it comes to designing sartorial wares. He also seems something deeply romantic in that, from the perspective of the fact that he likes the fact, is sort of rewarded and enthralled by the fact he's making items that will keep people warm through the coldest seasons. They're a sort of physical manifestation of a hug. He's at this really fractured point of his life where he doesn't know whether to pursue his creative ambitions or to take over the reins of the lighthouse. He wants to please everyone whilst being deeply sort of befuddled about what it means to please himself. He's curious about the world whilst feeling a deep guilt at wanting to explore anywhere beyond the place he's known as home. He feels a responsibility and a stewardship, not just for the island, but the nature that's there. He could tell you the name of every starfish and every rock pool on that island. And without him there, who would look after it? And he's a sort of the most vulnerable character, but perhaps...
But well, I thought that to begin with, but as we move on, I don't want to give stuff away, but I think he seems less vulnerable and more resilient in a way as we move on, becomes, for me, perhaps the least vulnerable, the most solid, the most calm and resolute. I don't know.
Well, that plays me like a joyous flute to hear that, because a lot of it is about his emotional journey. And I think we see him coating himself in armor. Plus, he's a social sponge. You know, he's able to read these characters exceptionally deftly well, and he's able to use them to grow himself as a human being. So I think he's a deeply intelligent creature that I guess keeps humble and keeps stum on a lot of his social intelligence from the outset. And perhaps the visitor that comes from afar is one of the more complex characters. Yes. He's a writerly dandy from Edinburgh. I'm not sure where I got the idea for that.
Is he supposed to be one aspect of you and Oos another aspect? Are you using your experience?
Do you know, I think I put a tincture of myself into each of the characters, into the father, into Figgy, into Robert Louis Stevenson, into Firth, and into Oos, and I merged them with people I knew and facets of them. But by the time I'd fleshed them out, by the time I'd experienced their presence in my mind, they're their own fully formed beings, and they've shed the version of me that I've put into them like a snake sheds its skin. You know, some people become method writers and they think they become their characters. Yeah. For me, that was never happening. I was always eavesdropping on their personal moments and feeling like I was the benefactor of deep personal, emotively charged conversations between them. I think with each of them, I regressed to what would have been an annoying younger sibling, and I followed them around for long enough to feel like I really know them without being able to fully make the decisions for them. And I creeped around in the absences and eavesdrops for as long enough that I felt I had this fully metalled version of their being, and then the father tossed me off a cliff.
Edinburgh Dandy, remind me of his name.
Firth. So all the characters are named after bodies of water.
Yes, I noted.
Firth, Oos, Sharon, Figgy, they all come from rivers, lochs, bodies of water, sea first. Because, you know, some people, some fantasy writers might say we have a spirit animal. I feel like we have a spirit body of water, the temperament of it, the water that we're drawn to.
Well, we are so much water, aren't we?
It's in most of our being.
So Firth, it doesn't give too much away to say, begins the novel in a pretty desperate place. And, I mean, it's just another way in which this is a perfect companion piece to Boyfriends, and is on the journey from that particular desperate place, just like Oos is on a journey in a different direction. Having completed Boyfriends and touring with Boyfriends and having done all that, was it clear in your mind that you're now using some of those same experiences and observations in this new format? Yeah,
I wanted to offer myself some solace. So Scott left this world by jumping off a bridge into the Firth of Forth. Now, I nearly enough started this novel with a character called Firth hanging off the side of a bridge that was debating his own life under the dominion of those stars and feeling like the world would be a better place without him in it. And it quickly becomes apparent that his main impetus for doing that is because he feels like he's of no value. And in fact, worse than that, he feels like he's a pernicious human being who will cause harm to everyone that loves him, so the world will be a better place without him in it. Now, I wanted to create a character that you immediately met. You saw the depths of the despair that he was in, but there wasn't a lot of words or a lot of time used exploring that. And really, we pulled him down from the bridge. And for better or worse, he claws his life back from the ashes of destruction. And so that every moment, every gulp of air that he takes henceforth is in defiance of death, and his whole life is an anthem of survival. And that happened so fast and so quickly that was almost an offering to myself in terms of cauterizing a wound. Now,
you got to save you, the omnipotent author.
Yeah.
You have the opportunity to save Firth.
I had the opportunity to save Firth, but more than that, I had the opportunity to walk back down with him from that bridge. And that was the solace I was looking for. Firth's dilemmas are not Scott's dilemmas. Firth's dilemmas are not what my own dilemmas would be under those circumstances. But he's a kindred human being deep in despair that I am able to walk alongside and ensure that his value in this world continues for a little bit longer. So there was something almost ceremonial in that for me.
What amazing agency and power, though, to be able to write a story and determine the outcomes, maybe in a way that they didn't work out in real life.
Yeah, I think that's what the fiction world exactly offers. There was a lot of wrongs I was looking to right. There was a lot of futures I was looking to explore that I couldn't explore in Boyfriends because it was my life. You know, they're all real people. They're all real stories. They're my version of those stories. Sure, there's always a degree of negotiation with the way that we experience things and how we relay those years later. But, you know, that's within a narrow field of trajectory. Whereas in the fictional world, I can cast these characters anew from that perspective. And I wrote into their futures and I mined upon their past. So I'm parachuting you into their lives from that perspective. But Firth saves himself and I'm there for the journey.
And another thing that I loved about Muckle Flugga, we've talked about the terrain and, you know, man and nature and that stuff has been, you know, celebrated. And I think the book's been described as epic in some quarters and so on. But there's an intimate part too. I love the whole food aspect.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're not in a foxhole. So we've got three men, they're isolated, but they're not in a foxhole. And they're not on a submarine. They are on a lighthouse. And of course, someone's got to do the cooking. Mm-hmm. Actually, even on a submarine, someone's got to do the cooking. But in this exploration of masculinity, you know, some of these nurturing things that we associate perhaps more with the late mother or with femininity, these things have to happen even when the mother is gone. You know, there've got to be provisions, there's got to be sewing, there's got to be cooking. And I loved those small touches as well. The Cullen skink in a bun. Yeah. I love the Cullen skink in a bun. I've never had Cullen skink in a bun, I think.
We need to see to that if you're a fish eater.
Of course. But, you know, the sealed bun and is it just a bun?
It's just a big fat bread roll. You carve out the gooey belly of it. You pour that salted cod fish soup into there, all creamy, all potatoey,
and if you're an outsider,
buttery.
You don't realise that it isn't just a great big bread roll to bite into.
No, they pop the top back on there and then it looks quite confusing. You know something's bubbling in the belly of it. You don't quite know how to get there. Firth gets presented with this almost as a trial or a rite of passage, and he very much fails, bites into
the city boy screws it up and has Cullen skink on his face.
But I love food. I love the language it creates between us. I love the fact that if someone's deep in grief or is paralysed in terms of shock or fear, that you might be able to create them something from a culinary perspective, something to eat that you can put in front of them, which starts having the conversation that you're not ready to have in language. It fills in the silences. It puts sustenance and nurture into the body at a point in time where it might be impossible for you to do that via the medium of your physical love because the person's not ready for it, and it fills in the absences. It takes them into a stronger piece.
For me, feels traditionally very feminine. You know, I'll just quietly push some food towards you, and having poured my creativity and my labour and my love into this.
Yeah, well, you know, That's a sort of thing, you know, the feminine male from that perspective. It's, I guess I've definitely been told I had feminine traits all my life, and it's easy to step away from that, but to try and rebrand some of those softer, more vulnerable traits as a part of masculinity, I think is such a vital thing to do. Otherwise, we leave masculinity to those that would eschew those things and that would push them out of the plate. It takes people, vulnerable males, putting such culinary craft to the fore and talking about the beauty and the benefit of that, and it's sort of and the language it has to fill the silence, and the language it has to love someone as a gesture, into a form of masculinity, and to take ownership of it in order to break down the barriers of what are that more aggressive testosterone driven male from that perspective. Anus has inherited a lot of that. He has a proclivity for it, and in fact it assuages his guilt knowing that he can gift someone food in a time that he can't be there to gift them something they need. And he takes great care in that, and he values that. You know, some of my most seminal friendships were forged around the dinner table, where we'd fought away from the clamour to be in those moments and put food into our bodies, sometimes not even talking, through exhaustion or just to inhabit the silence together. And there's this sort of food melody that exists between us, and that was so vital to bring into the novel at that point in time, and for us to be sort of masterfully in control of it.
And when Firth isn't at the shared table, it's kind of munching on some carrots, or it's not really happening in the same way, is it?
Yeah, it's knowing they wouldn't do that for themselves as well brings you a great joy. The father wouldn't make himself those meals. Firth wouldn't make himself those meals. But to us to bring them together around a dinner table with his craft and creation, knowing that he's probably leaving them both physically and biologically in a better place, and also emotionally because of what he's put into their body.
But I mustn't, well, there's a couple of characters who I mustn't neglect, because they are important characters too. And I'll come to RLS in a moment, but I've got to pay respect to Figgy, the woman. I mean, we've got the memory of the mother, but the live female character is Figgy. Tell me a bit more about her and the motivation and what's really going on there, and why she's doing this, why she's ferrying the provisions to the island, and often not even charging for them. Yeah,
so Figgy is many things, but I guess on paper she's the local storekeeper, the local postwoman, the local messenger, and she's well loved in the community. Her family's lived there for a few generations, and she almost halos around Muckle Flugga. She's a very motherly, protective figure in Usi's life. She'll never not be there for him, whether he realises that or not. She's often watching from afar, wishing good things upon him, and she sees it as basically a personal motivation to try and expose the father for the softer, more sentient human being he can, because she knew a version of himself that used to be like that before the grief that he was surfacing, before the tensions that existed between him and the community. There was a version of him which was more funful, more lovable, more jovial from that perspective, and she really feels indebted to him for the sacrifices he's made within himself to keep the island safe, to man that lighthouse, and she feels that other people don't appreciate that enough. So she's, I guess, a guardian angel, a watchful figure from afar from that perspective, but she's not perhaps as naive as those who are the recipients of all of her gifts would assume. She has her own biases and her own sort of emotional journeys that she's looking to go to from that perspective. And she's also fought to stay on that island. She's also half in love and, half restless with being there from that perspective. And she wants to be protective, but she wants to have some agency and control over that. And I guess that was a homage to all the beautiful, watchful female friendships and female elder figures that I had around me that were giving me an emotional compass to deal with the male friendships I had around me. It pays homage to the fact that the memory of the mother is kilted over the island, but the physical presence of Figgy is there as adjudicator, as a guidance giver, of all of these different roles, but primarily as a caregiver, and each of them love her and value what she does, but it's so easy to forget just how much gratitude they really should have to her under those circumstances. And she has her own journey where she tries to pull away from the island at one point and ends up in Aberdeen Law School of all places, but finds herself tethered back there because she knows she can be of value, and it's hard to leave under those circumstances. Anyone that's felt tethered to a position or a role because they know nobody could do it better than them.
And that's mirrored to some extent in Ooze, and the public service part is to some extent mirrored in the Father. You know, there are these strands that unite them. But look,
she's named after my favourite burn in Edinburgh as well, which is actually called the Figget Burn. It was the one that ran round the back of my school, and actually some of the older kids would make you jump at an impossible point.
Wow.
So it also had its own trials and tribulations within it. And, you know, you wouldn't eat a fish that came out the Figgy Burn, but
look,
you were glad it was there.
In the inevitable eventual movie, or I don't know, Netflix miniseries or whatever it's going to be of Muckle Flugga, I can't wait to see who is cast as the ghost of Robert Louis Stevenson.
Yeah. So do you know, I actually wrote the book in a very strange way. As you were saying, it was a new genre for me. It was a first book. I was definitely flying by the seat of my pants to a certain extent. Yet I had a fervency that, you know, pushed me forward and allowed me to believe that I could do this, having worshipped at the altar of novels since, you know, as early as I could read. And I'd been doing a bit of script writing with a TV director, a guy called Robert McKillop, who's, you know, he's doing the new season of Slow Horses, but before that he did things here called Guilt and just did that Ludwig series. And me and him were doing some script writing together. It was lockdown. We both didn't have too much going on. It was a great thing to do, a sort of project to see us through. And I was very much in that vein of writing. So when it came to writing the novel, I'd proposed this as a script synopsis, and he says, that's great, you need to write it as a novel first. So I wrote a script synopsis for Muckle Flugga.
So I'm not wrong, am I?
No, so there was a cinematic inclination from the outset, and then I ended up writing the novel based on a synopsis for a script that's never written for a film that's not yet been made.
So I'm not wrong. I'm proud of myself.
Yeah, so it was, you know, characters, location, happening, and I held myself back from any of the poetic aberrations, any of the like natural world descriptions, and any of the dialogue to make sure that this existed with a driving story engine before I allowed myself to linguistically flourish it.
So were you like a great screenwriter seeing it in pictures rather than words?
Both at the same time, you know. They were there together. So the fact that nearly every person that read the book when they were giving us quotes or journalists commented on the cinematic nature of it, and in fact so many people I was in discussion with started casting it to me. So I've got...
Do you think this is because of the time we're in and the generation that we're in, and because we're a quarter of the way into the 21st century and we've had cinema with us for so long, and now we have just so many images and pictures in our lives that even novelists and poets are even more visual than they ever were?
I think so. I think you visualize your interpretation of a novel or a story based on how you would create the film to a certain extent. So if you've loved movies as much as you've loved books, which I have in my life.
Which I have, I have to say.
Then I think a lot of the visual identity of any novel I create is the movie, is how I would make the movie.
And the ghost of I've got to come back to the, because we love a ghost story, and we love scary ghosts, but we don't need a scary ghost, because the people are scary enough. But we've got a funny, friendly rascal of a ghost.
Yeah. So
is that a good depiction?
I think that's apt, and I think it's generous. So we encounter Us at a point in time. He's at this big juncture. What to do with his own life. Firth comes with all of these ideas about how to influence his own life, influence Us's life. Us is looking up at Firth and is in admiration of his his artistic credentials, his flamboyance. He thinks there's a lot of answers in this human being, yet at the same time he's quite intimidated by the things that he's suggesting to him, and the same way that he's intimidated by the things the father's suggesting to him. And Use is the youngest character. I couldn't leave him alone to make those big decisions, so I felt he needed a life coach and a confidant, and I thought, who better for Use than his favourite writer, Robert Louis Stevenson. So I resurrected him, I exhumed him from the dead, and I gave his spectral form to Use as a life coach's confidant. And of course, Robert Louis Stevenson is as sort of discombobulatingly, flabbergastingly confusing as he is useful. He never really gives a clear-cut answer. He's mostly doing hack tricks with his felt fedora and regaling him with stories of the past, but he's deeply invested in Use as a sentient human being. He wants the best for him, and he loves him, and he relishes him. And as Robert Louis Stevenson says himself, he's someone who has abdicated from a lighthouse family to pursue creative passions, and was told by his own father that in doing so he would render his whole life useless. And of course, now we know the Stevenson name because of him as a writer, as opposed to the rich legacy he had before him of lighthouse engineers and designers. In fact, his uncle and father together designed Muckle Flugga Lighthouse, the very lighthouse that Use is living in. So in terms of someone that has a precedent or a sapience for experiencing those emotional dilemmas, RLS is a key figure. Also, I love RLS. I won the Robert Louis Stevenson Prize when I was young. I got to go to France, to Grèce-sur-Léon, where he met his wife-to-be, Fanny Osborne. Robert Louis Stevenson also studied law as an amicable negotiation. He was studying engineering at Edinburgh University first, then quit because he wanted to be a writer. The decision reached between him and his father that would keep the pieces as he went back to study law for its literary aspects.
There's a compromise.
I'm not saying I'm the modern manifestation of Robert Louis Stevenson, but if you were to imply that, I would not refute it.
Well, I consider it implied.
I appreciate that.
Consider it implied. No, I loved that. And we get some light relief, we get some comic relief, we get, I that was a wonderful, wonderful touch, I think.
Also, immediately, I'm equally loyal and disloyal, just like the genre, to the island of Muckle Flugga. My Muckle Flugga is 10 times the size of the real one. I've put flora and fauna on there that couldn't exist under those climates.
You shouldn't be giving this away in the I suppose in the Speakeasy anything goes, right?
In the Speakeasy anything goes. No, but it comes apparent quite quickly. I'm talking about krakens and mermaids and giants and black arrow sharks and species that have conjured into existence. So,
but it worked. And you know what? There are no mobile phones.
There are no mobile phones. There's no technology. Do you know, it's easy to take the reader into a period of technological timelessness when you're going onto a remote island.
Well, I
that's
thought about this a lot. There are occasionally, when you put a book down, you go back and I'm thinking, when was this? When was this set? I'm in this novel. I'm on this journey. I'm deep into the to the plot and the characters, and I care about them and all that good stuff. And I'm like, but when is this? And I'm like, Shami, you don't know. There aren't so many clues, but there are no mobile phones. However, that could just be because there's no signal and there's no point and there's no Wi-Fi and blah blah blah. It doesn't have to mean that this was years ago, or So that is really helpful in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, I really wanted to create a timeless terrain. So it was all about the emotional journeys of the characters, the sort of reverence for nature and the landscape, the mystical up against the historical. Because, the real Muckle Flugga island and lighthouse, it was built during the Crimean War to light those passageways for Navy vessels. So, it was born out of war and it never stopped fighting since. The folkloric story behind those formations of Muckle Flugga and Outstack as islands is it was in fact two warring giants trying to, in their own testosterone, bravado-filled fashion, demonstrate their brawn to one another by throwing these large rocks into the water. In fact, they were trying to win the affections of a mermaid who's described in the Shetlandic folklore as a vicious temptress. I, in fact, think these giants were catcalling the mermaid.
Wicked mermaids and sirens and Medusas and all these terrible creatures.
The flip side of that is they were actually catcalling the mermaid, and she, after relenting, having had enough of this tomfoolery, says to them, right, let's have a race to the North Pole. Whoever gets there first after me, because let's face it, I'm going to win, can have my heart in marriage. Both the giants full of that machismo, fire into the water, thrashing their limbs around like epileptic fish, and all of a sudden then remember that neither of them can swim and they both drown. And Us, our main character, thinks that's one of the most romantic things he's ever heard. And I'm inclined to agree.
And we're in this beautiful, mystical space where man and nature have to come to a negotiation. But over there somewhere far away, we've got the wicked bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Clams?
The Clams. The Keepers and Lighthouses Association of Scotland, which are, I guess, yeah, they are our authority. They are our sort of the father's manifestation of the sort of snobby political elite of Edinburgh, who are full of qualifications and smugness, whilst entirely would be effete and running a lighthouse in any
And they don't
capacity.
really care, and we can just duck and dive, and they probably know that we don't have the right number of people. But
Yeah.
they'll sort of look the other way. Yeah.
So there is this foreboding nature of Edinburgh bureaucracy leaning over
As
them.
a threat. It's a sort of threat. We've got all the physical, natural threats, but we've got that bureaucratic human threat just kind of lurking. I think that's beautifully done. It's understated, but it's ever present.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's testament to the nature of the father. You know, in the one sense, he is terrified about that. The prospect of them coming up here, of
And
further
shutting it all
regulating
down
him, of
and, yeah.
shutting it down, of changing his life, of automating the lighthouses. Yet at the same time, he would not admit in front of company that that was in any way one iota a possibility, that's something that he would ever permit to happen, because he wants to be seen as invincible for that perspective. He's entirely ashamed of voicing any of his fears as far as that goes. And I think that is sort of totemic throughout his approaches to love and life and loss and all of these things that make him that, you know, brilliantly belligerent, bifurcated being.
So it's a wonderful, wonderful first novel, falling hard upon the wonderful first memoir and all the beautiful poetry. But there's something next, obviously.
Yeah, do you know, it was a 2-novel deal with Faber, so I owe them another book. And at this juncture in time, I'm exploring 2 books. I'm exploring a sequel to this book, and I'm exploring a self-contained story, which again, in the same way that Muckle Flugga was thematically linked to Boyfriends, would be thematically linked to that. So I'm fleshing both of those out, and come January, it'll come the time to try and crack the back of a first draft. I've scored off that entire month the same way I did when I wrote Muckle Flugga, and I'll write 10 till 4 every day and edit 7 till 9 every evening. And by the end of that month, I'll hope to have the first draft of a new novel.
That is a relentless, intense process.
It's an intense process, but do you know what? For writing long-form prose, it works for me to feel like you're almost connected by the mycelial networks to every character in that book, knowing every change that you make to them reverberates in either direction. I feel like it has to be a piece of deep absorption. And that's poetry I can write in stolen moments. You know, it's all about flinging your life, you parachuting someone into your life fast and pulling them back out of it and leaving them with the lingering supposition of yes, me too, or now I feel a little bit more understood or less alone, and making that happen almost in a whirlwind of the moment. At least my type of poetry, which is quite narrative, which is really vibrant, which has a sort of exuberant joy in it, whereas the long form prose, I have to almost
Total immersion.
give myself
10
to it.
till 4 and then 7 till 9.
That's what I did.
You can take the boy out of the city law firm, but you can't take the city law firm out of the poet.
It's the only time I'd be willing to sign out the European Working Time Regulations.
The final question.
Yeah.
Towards the end of Boyfriends, you see a young boy who's hanging back from the crowd a little bit, and in his weird, beautiful sweater, and why is he hanging back? Is he excluded, or does he exclude himself? And you have all these thoughts that you maybe want to share with him, but don't actually share them. But of course, it's a lovely vehicle for you to comment on the world. Even though it's your story, you've still got that observation, that narrative. What does Michael Pedersen, the Edinburgh Macker, and the celebrated author say to the young Michael of that sort of age?
Just to love recklessly, unencumbered. Don't be ashamed of your vulnerabilities. You know, we're all carrying so many vulnerabilities around with us, and people will try to capitalize upon the fears and the things that pull us apart rather than the majority of human facets, the commonhoods which draw us together. So always, always focus on the joy and rally back towards the light.
Michael, thank you so much for sharing so generously with your love and your joy and your storytelling in the Speakeasy. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a total thrill. Thank you so much.